Our goal in this trending stories section of the Climate Web is to give you a little bit more insight into certain topics that are frequently in the news or that have been particularly in the news very recently. This one relates to sea level rise. Sea level rise has been in the news for years, and you'll see a constant stream of stories relating to how fast sea level's rising, how much it will rise over time, et cetera, et cetera. And so we thought it would be useful to give you a quick sort of trending stories assessment of the topic. I'm going to jump in and give you a slide that follows along the discussion here. And several key points. One, the long-term picture of sea level rise is pretty clear. Now, by long-term, we mean hundreds of years, 500 years, 1,000 years. And if all the ice melts, which is very possible over that period of time, given current temperature trends, we know that sea levels will be about 215 feet higher than they are today. And they've been that much higher in the past, in the distant past, as the ice has melted and come back together again. So we have a pretty good sense of the long-term picture of climate change. The short-term picture is where things get really confusing and much more uncertain. Now, one of the key points is that the nearer-term forecasts, and by this I'm really talking about 2100, so still eight decades away. Those forecasts are only getting worse over time, or the prevailing estimates are only getting worse over time. So for many years, we heard about 3 feet of sea level rise by 2100. Then it started to move up, and now a very common number is 6 feet of sea level rise by 2100. Now, more recently, a few months ago, there were actually a whole series of stories about a possible projection of 6 feet by 2050, which is obviously a huge game changer in terms of 2050 isn't that far away for an awful lot of infrastructure around today. Now, that number turns out to have been partially misattributed to the person making it in terms of the press coverage, and we've stepped back a little bit from that number. But the key point to remember here is that these nearer term forecasts, particularly if you're talking 10, 20, 30 years, but even the 50, 60, 70, 80 year forecasts, the nearer term forecasts, are very uncertain. We have lots of models. We have a lot of stuff that we think is happening in Greenland, that we think is happening in the Antarctic. Lots of people are putting together models of what they see happening with warmer water coming up and melting ice in some of the Antarctic zones. But the reality is the current climate system is being forced much more rapidly, an order of magnitude more rapidly through human activities and temperature change and the amount of energy and heat going into the oceans than has ever happened before. So it's very difficult to know how the system will react and over what timescales. We do know that sea ice, or not sea ice, but ice has melted in the past in some very short periods of time, leading to very rapid sea level rise in the history of sea level rise. But the reality is that there's just a lot of uncertainty, and it is impossible to assign probabilities to certain levels of sea level rise when you're talking about what's going to happen by 2050 or by 2100. You can do sort of modified Delphi studies of talking to a lot of different scientists and getting their estimates, but it's been pointed out that you really can't do probabilities because we don't have the data. Now, it's important to recognize that this is a big deal even now, because we're seeing more and more of what's called king tides in Florida, where the moon lines up and you get sort of big tides. More and more flooding is happening, streets that are flooding on an almost routine basis now, including on the West Coast in some places. So it doesn't take a lot of sea level rise to start to have a significant impact, given that our infrastructure was sort of designed with the idea that sea levels would be stable. Now, sea level rise is very local, and so you've got to look at estimates of what's happening locally to really have an understanding of what the global numbers mean. But especially when you start thinking about storm surges, possible hurricane impacts, even small amounts of sea level rise can actually have totally disproportionate impacts on our infrastructure and our homes. So that's why it's a big deal even now, and will be an increasingly big deal for real estate markets, even in the relatively short term. So that's a quick look at sort of this trending story of sea level rise. I'll point out that in the Climate Web, we've linked to this story, we've linked some news, and this is always changing, so you'll see more recent news here as well. But if you want to do any more research into the topic, jump over to this index entry, Sea Level Rise, SLR, and you'll see several things. First of all, you'll see a sea level rise dashboard, which pulls together a great deal of information and insight on the sea level rise issue. You will also see the Sea Level Rise deep dive, which allows you to really dive as deep as you want into the topic of sea level rise. It's a very big issue. We have hundreds of documents, hundreds of news stories, and blogs, and much more here in the Climate Web if you want to dig deeper into some of these different topics, including specific index topics like real estate values and king tides. So I hope that's been a useful review of the trending story of sea level rise, and if there are aspects you'd like to see us cover in more depth in these videos, please let us know.